Good afternoon. Good to see you guys again today. We're back with another episode 26, halfway.
Yeah, right. It is halfway.
That just dawned on me. Halfway through reading through the Bible in a year.
That's crazy.
Which is probably a good spot today to hit the halfway point because of our subject material.
Yes, we're kind of reaching the
end of
a big overarching story.
Yeah, and it doesn't end too well.
No.
We're left with a little glimmer of hope, but we'll get there. Yeah, but hope you all had a wonderful Thanksgiving, that you're doing well. We're just going to dive right into it because there's a lot of material to cover today with the whole Second Kings. But what's the plan of attack for the week in terms of what's scheduled for us to read?
We are scheduled for Psalm 76 to 78, Proverbs 13 through 16, and 2 Kings 11 through 25. So finishing off Kings today, this week.
And next week we'll cover Philippians. I think that's going to be the goal. Yep. And then we'll dig into Chronicles, which is its own kind of a fun book because you're just like, well, didn't we just read all this?
But there's a different kind of purpose behind Chronicles than there was behind Kings.
And there's a different flavor. And in fact, there's some stories there that aren't in the book of Kings. Yeah. So it's just kind of like the Gospels, how some of the Gospels supplement each other. So this is just another witness.
The thing is that Chronicles written quite a bit later than Kings.
After the exile.
Yeah, and Kings is written like at the beginning of the exile.
Could be, or just picking up the records as the Kings are going along. Yeah, or not, not exactly sure how they all came formulated together. Because Chronicles references Kings as a source. So you kind of get that thought here that's written maybe before the exile happens, but or even as it's getting going. So I kind of left with that, and then Chronicles is written after the people. It's like, hey, here's our history. Let's retell it, and here's what we need to remember. So that becomes a big theme here too. So Kings and Chronicles do play off of each other, and they each have their own flavors that we'll cover. But today we're back into 2 Kings. What do you notice as you're kind of reading 2 Kings? What's maybe shocking? What's something that, or maybe not too shocking if you've been following the biblical story so far? Anything? What sticks out to you?
Well, there's a lot of kings' names that you have to try to keep straight.
Yeah.
There's some who only reigned for like 3 months, and some who reigned 52 years.
Right.
So you kind of get straight. You kind of keep getting the repetitive. I mean, a lot of them did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They did some pretty terrible things, actually. Some of them.
Yeah.
And then you get everything else in the reign you can read about in this other book that we don't have.
Right.
But
maybe we'll talk a little bit more of that when we see it. These are just this is a compilation of records that are being brought together of each of the kings. They're summarized. We don't hear a lot about many of the kings.
No, there's a couple. I think was it Hezekiah, Josiah. We get a few more.
Yeah. So especially if they're faithful kings, we tend to focus on them a little bit more.
Yeah.
If they're unfaithful, they just kind of get they were not good kings.
It's quite a bit about Jehu.
Right. Yeah, because he's the one who's been fulfilling of Elisha has him to do.
Because we get Elijah dies here at the beginning, and then we get Elisha. Some interesting stories from him too.
Right.
Miracles.
Yeah. So you get the prophets. Elisha we pick up here today too, and we kind of if you want to try to remember the big picture what's going on here, because you can kind of lose that a bit with this king did this, and then that king, and then this king over here, and whatnot. Is that, remember, we have the two kingdoms, the north kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah. Judah follows the line of David, right? So all their kings come from David's line. The northern kingdom, it just kind of whatever.
Whoever happens to have killed the previous king sometimes.
Pretty much. Yeah, so it's not a good situation up there. All the kings of the north are, falling away.
Yeah, because something you realized when you were doing the Bible document this week was that there's 20 kings for each.
22, I do believe. 22. Yeah.
For each the north and the south, but the southern kingdom, Judah, existed for 200 years longer.
Yeah.
So their kings reigned for a lot longer periods of time than Israel was usually a lot shorter.
A lot more stable.
Yeah.
Because they follow the promise that God had given.
Generally.
Yeah, there's some few bad ones in there. Manasseh, he's like the worst. In fact, Manasseh's the reason why God's like, nope, you're going into exile and there's nothing you're going to do to change. So when Josiah comes along, right? Oh, even though he does a lot of these reforms, it's almost kind of too late. It's too little, too late when Josiah comes around.
Yeah,
and he has a disappointing death. In fact,
and even if you have a good king, usually, like I said, the next one is like
undoes it.
Terrible, and it's like, okay, your father did all these great things. Yeah.
And throughout this book too, we're trying to keep in mind the promise that God made to David, right? That a son will sit on the throne forever. So the book of Kings, you're kind of saying, okay, how's this going to play out? How is God able to achieve his promises when we get story after story of king who just goes off the deep end and forsakes the Lord and goes after other gods, right? It's kind of horrifying. So how is God going to be able to keep this promise when it just seems that everything is just falling apart? This is the final gasp of the kingdoms here. The general overview is we finally do get the destruction of the northern kingdom in 722 BC, and then we have the fall of the southern kingdom in Jerusalem in about 587, 586. So this is taking over several. Once again, we're covering hundreds of years of history here. And a relatively short book. I mean, it's 25 chapters long as Second Kings.
Yeah. Well, a lot of this does go pretty quick.
Yeah.
And some of the kings get nothing.
No screen time. Yeah. But there's a few that we'll focus in on today, especially. Yeah. So, we just kind of start doing some of the general themes that we see as we go through the book. Then we left off with, if you remember, Ahab, and going to war, and there's some trickery there with Jehoshaphat, I do believe.
I get all the names really screwed up after, Jehoshaphat.
And Ahab, and remember they went into battle together to fight, right. And Ahab had disguised himself as some common soldier, but some random guy shoots him, and he dies, and so he dies in battle, and Jehoshaphat, he lives, he survives the battle, even though he was set up to fail. And then we kind of pick up then with, Ahab is now dead, who was a really bad king. He's kind of quintessential northern king of Israel, just a really bad guy. He's dead, and we pick up then with Elijah and Elisha. So it's kind of a really weird spot to pick up again. But here we are with the prophets, and what do you see with some of the Elijah and Elisha and some of the things that they do? What kind of jumps out at you?
Well, what was this original the first story here about the man of God who says, how does this go again? With Thanksgiving, I read this a week ago now. The king's going to go inquire with Baal, the prophet of Baal, and they run into Elijah instead.
Surprise!
Wait, why are you going to Baal? Isn't there a God in Israel?
Right.
That seems to kind of be how Elijah works with these kings.
Right. He's very upfront,
Yeah.
And I love how we're described. Elijah, he wore a garment of hair with a belt of leather around his waist. And who does that remind you of?
John the Baptist.
John the Baptist, right? And
John the Baptist is the Elijah that is to come.
Exactly. So when you're reading this, you're like, oh, wait a minute. And we're in the season of Advent right now, and this upcoming Sunday is Elijah. John the Baptist.
Yeah, we get him the next 2 weeks, basically.
Which I love. And I'm probably mentioning the sermon here a little bit this week, but what I love about John the Baptist and Elijah here is that you can't really market these guys. You really can't sell them. We don't, and they would hate it too. You can't put John the Baptist in our nativity outside, right? Because you had these beautifully dressed people, and they look really nice, and then you'd have some wild man and wearing leather and camel hair and whatnot, and eating locusts, and
they don't say what they're supposed to either.
Exactly, and it makes the kings mad. We find out this week that John the Baptist is thrown in prison because of what he's saying.
He makes the Pharisees mad, and the scribes mad, and the king mad,
because he's here to speak what needs to be said. It's you gotta love that with Elijah here too.
Yeah, there's a lot about Elijah that's actually really funny, and you're supposed to find some of these stories actually funny.
Yeah, and ironic and tragic, and it's kind of you almost can't if you're really reading this and understanding kind of what's going on. You can picture it. You're not supposed to read this with a straight face. It's just
it's not
interesting.
You're supposed to read it as a story, not as a. People have a tendency to think to read a lot of this as a rule book,
right?
And the Bible isn't largely a rule book. I mean, there's rules in it, but it is just. I mean, it is the story of stuff that actually happened.
And how dry is that too?
Yeah, some of it is. It's supposed to be funny. I mean, and like you said, tragic and sad, and it's a good story that actually happened.
Right. And talk about this story ends tragically here in 2 Kings with all these promises seem to come to an end. But I love here Elijah too. He kind of says the word. Was it the guy falls through? He dies. He's kind of Elijah speaks. And he does, therefore you should not come on to the bed of which you've gone up, but you shall surely die, because he hasn't kept faith. And so picking up the book here, 2 Kings, we kind of see here this confrontation with Elijah is kind of foreshadowing how the book is going to end. With these kings falling away from the word of the Lord, going after other gods, even in the face of death and destruction, they still fall away. And we see here an image of, okay, this is what's going to happen to your kingdom too. So this reminds us what Peter says that in Paul, that these things were written for our instruction, for our example. If you see them, be like, oh yeah, we should not desire to do this as they did. We should turn from our way.
It does not end well.
It doesn't end well if you follow this path. And so when we see ourselves, okay, there's this path leads, I don't want to go down it either. Let's go down
even if it looks like a good path, it's not a good path.
Right. It can be, our looks can be deceiving, right? Which is probably why a lot of these kings are deceived, because it looks easier. They don't have to deal with the conflict if they just allow the worship of other gods to happen.
Well, like we said, stuff going on, and the kingdoms it's not like they weren't prosperous.
Yeah.
Always. There were times they were at war and all that, but the daily life for a lot of the people living in these kingdoms probably wasn't all that bad.
Yeah. Or I think it's when you get Uzziah in the south and Jeroboam II in the top, they're both ruling around the same time, and they rule for a very long time, for like half a century. And we're told that this time it's kind of like a silver age. It's a really good age where people kind of, some people have their own, like a winter house and things like that. They can go somewhere for winter. So things are actually really good. But we see that they get this off of, corruption and greed and murder and stuff like that, which, you'll see this time and time again here too. So we have the stories of the prophets, Elijah, and then of course the famous story of Elijah. Here's a famous Sunday school lesson.
Elijah does not die.
Elijah doesn't die. Yeah,
only one of two people in the Bible who were told, because is it Enoch in Genesis? Yeah, he walked with God and then he was no more. Yeah, so that's
poor guy.
Believe that he did not die.
Right.
So yeah, Elijah is taking up. It's actually, this reminds me a little bit of even Jesus' ascension, kind of. Makes me think of that.
We should get that, that theme.
The whole, because here, fiery chariot comes down and takes him up, and Elisha saw him no more.
Yeah. This story plays again later towards the end of the book, but I forget where off the top of my head. But here, I love it too, because Elisha has a request for Elijah. I want a double portion of your spirit, and he's like, well, what you've asked for is really hard. And so, you understand the New Testament when they're looking for Elijah to come back. And so when they say John the Baptist is Elijah, they're kind of stuck on that idea because they thought the Elijah who ascended into heaven was supposed to come back. And so when they hear John the Baptist, they're like, whoa, I thought Elijah. And he's like, well, he is Elijah. And here, not like reincarnated or something like that, but like the spirit of Elijah. Yeah. And we see that here at the end when Elijah is finally taken up into heaven. He takes the cloak falls down, and Elisha picks up Elijah's cloak, and he picks up the mantle of the prophet, literally. And he's, where is the Lord, the God of Elijah? And he strikes the water, and it separates. So it kind of redoes this famous splitting of the water in half. And then verse 15 of chapter 2, when the sons of the prophets who were at Jericho saw him opposite them, they said, "The spirit of Elijah rests on Elisha." So we have that idea here that it's not Elijah himself, but the spirit of Elijah, which is the spirit of the prophets, the spirit of that prophetic message that comes down. And we see that on John the Baptist too. He comes in the spirit of Elijah to finish Elijah's work. It's almost like John the Baptist comes to finish Elijah's work, which is kind of a cool thought. So Elisha succeeds him. We got a few stories about Elisha and his life and some of his deeds.
Yeah, was it the widow's oil that doesn't? Is that that's the one that she keeps filling the jars and the oil doesn't run out until she runs out of jars to fill it up with, and the floating axe head and the purifying the deadly stew. So all these random.
There's death in the pot. I love that. They would say that about someone's cooking. There's death in the pot.
But some people try to make sense of some of these miracles, like, well, because how does he raise the axe head? Isn't it tosses a piece of wood in or something like that?
And it causes it to float.
Yeah, and people try to come up with a scientific explanation, and I mean, it is just...
It's just the means by which Elisha accomplishes this.
Yeah, God uses physical means to accomplish miracles.
Yeah.
Which we often forget that.
And that's true. I do love always one of the story I just appreciate here too is Elijah and the Shunammite woman here. So Elisha kind of spends the time with this woman here, and he actually gives her a lot. If you think about it, he allows her to survive through the upcoming kind of plague going on, the famine, and then he promises her a son, which she at first is kind of like I don't know, this seems kind of too much that I would get. But she does get a son, and then, of course, the son dies, which, she's really tragic about, and it's upsetting. And it's kind of one of those interesting things, too, when the servant was look, there's a Shunammite running, come get her, and he's just like, I don't know, the Lord has not revealed to me. I always kind of find it interesting that the prophet of God here is kept, information is kept from him. You can see that a little bit of Jesus, right? He does not use his divine nature to kind of know everything, like who touched me and falling asleep in a boat and things like that. So we get a little bit of a hint of Jesus here too. But then, of course, Elisha does come and raise her son from the dead. Another one of those interesting pointing ahead here to Jesus and kind of how the prophets, kind of give us glimpses of the work of Jesus Christ too. And
the disciples almost should have known Jesus was going to rise from the dead because, I mean, anytime that God is working...
this stuff happens, right? And you see this pattern in Scripture a lot. So we've had Moses. Moses did all these great signs and wonders, but he wasn't able to finish the task. Joshua, the Lord saves, brings the people in. We see here Elijah has these great wonders. He's this mighty prophet, right? But he's not able to finish the work that Elisha has to come and finish it. And then, of course, you get to New Testament, John the Baptist. He does these many great signs and wonders, and people are amazed at what he has to say. But he's not able to finish the work. Jesus comes and finishes it. So we see this pattern happen a lot in the Bible, where you have this great figure who comes along and does this great work, but someone else has to pick up the mantle and finish the task. And we see that would ultimately point ahead to Jesus.
The work is never done until it is.
Until it is, yep. Until Jesus says it's finished.
Yeah.
So kind of fascinating stuff. So he raises the Shunammite's son from the dead. He purifies the deadly stew, as we already mentioned here as well. And then there's an interesting account, pausing because we're reflecting on the life of the prophets here. Chapter 5, there's Naaman here, and it has leprosy. And what maybe sticks out to you about this account?
Well, he's commander of the army of the king of Syria, so he's not an Israelite. And was it one of his wife's servants is an Israelite? Was it?
Yeah.
And she's like, if there's a prophet, a prophet could cure you. And he sends it so the letter gets sent, and how does this go? Yeah. Okay, you're going to have to pick it up.
No, you're fine. What I liked about this story is, one, we get a foreshadowing of the exile here, because we're told that Naaman, he's a commander in the army of the king of Syria. He's with his master of high favor, and because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. So here we're told that God is giving victory to other nations.
Right.
So here the Lord is above them. He was a mighty man of valor, but he was a leper, so he has disease. Now, on the Syrians, on one of their raids, had carried off a little girl from the land of Israel and was worked into the service of Naaman's wife. So here we have this little girl here is already in exile. She's been carried away from the land of Israel. And what's going to happen to her is a foreshadowing of what's going to happen to the people of Israel and Judah later on. They're going to get carried away into exile too when we read stories like Daniel and Esther, and even Ezekiel a little bit. We have these stories of their faithfulness and their witness to, we have the God of Israel, right? And they're like, we see how much that changes and impacts the witness out there. So what the people of Israel failed to do in their own country, to be a light to the world, they end up doing elsewhere. Yeah. So this kind of shows us that beyond the exile, there is yet hope for what is to come. And when we get to the end of the Old Testament, that's what's going to happen. These people are scattered everywhere. Jesus, right? He sends us to the ends of the earth to do the same thing. So we kind of see that God's mission is not, central, but it's almost spread out, fill the earth, subdue it.
I suppose it's, like Christians are in exile. We often say we're doing more in exile than we could in.
Right. Yeah, if we were all gathered into one country, and to be a Christian, you had to live over here and do that.
Yeah. Which one thing I do find interesting. This pops up a few times in Second Kings. The idea of each god being like localized. Yeah. Because this happens later when the northern kingdom's exiled and God sends lions, and it's the same. Like here where it's like, oh, we have to send to this land to find this god to cure him. Right. Whereas they're like, oh, well, we don't know what this god of this land wants, how to be worshipped, and they have this whereas God is not localized. I mean, obviously, he's moving around in here. I mean, even like when we talked about in at the beginning of 1 Samuel when the ark goes on vacation. I just find that interesting that the ancient idea of like gods being localized. We still kind of get that a little bit now, where people are like, oh, if you grew up in the Middle East, you're going to be Muslim. If you grew up in India, you're going to be Hindu, and that's not how Christianity works. Right. Yeah, God is the God of all people, right? And you do see that kind of sometimes even the Israelites get caught in that idea too, like, oh, God is God just here. You get that with Jonah. Yeah. Right? He runs away, thinking, oh, once I'm out of Israel, I'm kind of out of God's control, which, surprise, surprise, the storm rolls in the sea. Which the Israelites should know better, because, God got them out of Egypt, brought them all the way through the wilderness, brought them to this land. Which is funny, because when Jonah was his confession, oh, I worship the Lord who made the heavens and the earth. And he's like, okay, Jonah, then why the world did you think you could run away? So we do kind of see that kind of thought for some of the Israelites is, oh, God is just a God right here and not anywhere else. And here we see more of this, well, God is. The ignorance he puts up with until later on we'll find New Testament, right? Acts. God put up with this, but now that's done. He's made himself a witness. What I also like in this story is that, when Naaman finally gets a hold of Elisha, basically, because first the king is like, what is it? Who am I? Am I God to kill and to make alive? And basically, oh, I can't cure this guy's leprosy. But Elisha's like, okay. Come on, dude. And he's like, go wash in the river 7 times. And Naaman's like not happy because he wants this big grand miracle, apparently. He wants he wants all the magic and the signs and whoa, and be like, wow. Like, just go wash. I think we fall into that sometimes too, where we want this big grand show, and that's not how God works usually. Yeah, he's not here to entertain us in that way. He's not capture our fancy. He's gonna get the job done. And of course, what rivers he sent to wash in. Oh, the Jordan. The Jordan River, right? So here we get this image of the Jordan River. What does John the Baptist do? He's baptizing in the Jordan River. So when we read this account in Kings and we read about John the Baptist doing this, we should be saying, oh, just like Naaman. And he went and he was cleansed. And who was he? He's a foreigner. So, you should already start putting these pieces together. This is why you need to know the Old Testament. Right. It's just, everything is just grabbing you here. So he goes and washes 7 times in the Jordan River and he's cleansed. Right? And I love his reaction, like, why would I want to go on that stinking river over there? Isn't the rivers of my own country far better? And I love the servant person comes like, dude, if he told you to do that and that's going to work, like, why not just do that? And he's like, oh yeah, good point. And he eventually doesn't. And he does. He comes out so clean that we're told he has the flesh of a little child, right? Like a little baby smooth, right? That's how we would say it. So his skin is restored and his flesh is made good. And then it's kind of an interesting point here too. He wants to give a present to Elisha. He's like, wow, this wonderful thing has happened. Let me give you something for this. And Elisha's like, no, I'm not here to take your stuff, right? Take it and go. I'm not here to do this. But then we're told that Gehazi here, the servant of Elisha, says go back and says, oh, wait, hold on 1 second. Let me see. And he's like, all's well. My master has sent me to say, there have just now come to me from the hill country of Ephraim 2 young men of the sons of the prophets. Please give me a talent of silver and 2 changes of clothing. And Naaman said, please be pleased to accept 2 talents. And he urged him and tied up 2 talents of silver and two bags with 2 changes of clothing and laid them before 2 of his servants. And they carried them before Gehazi. And then, of course, Elisha finds out about this and isn't pleased because here, this gift that he had just given to this foreigner for free,
is now looks like he got charged for it. And Elisha's like, he just spoiled what was a good gift. And he isn't pleased with that. So now he gets the leprosy. So what was clean to Naaman now goes on to his servant.
Which I sometimes wonder every time I read that if one of the lepers that Jesus healed wasn't his descendant.
That'd be a thought.
Because he says the leprosy will cling to you and your descendants forever. And it's just,
Yeah.
it's one of those you can't prove it either way. It doesn't really matter. It's just one of those curiosities. I always kind of wonder. There's one of Gehazi's descendants that Jesus cleanses.
Yeah.
But
it's a thought, isn't it? Yeah, it makes you wonder if you could trace some of those lines.
Yeah. But Naaman's story also can be people use this nowadays to when Christians are stuck in jobs that it's hard maybe to be because he says it.
Good catch.
About the he's only going to burn offerings or sacrifices to no God but the Lord. But if in this manner may the Lord pardon your servant when my master goes into the house of Rimmon to worship there, leaning on my arm, and I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, and when I bow myself, oh my goodness, this repeats in here for some reason. The Lord pardon your servant in this matter. So basically, in his job, he's still going to have to bow before this other god, but that's about doing his duty.
Yeah. And once again, we're going to have this upcoming Sunday. We read about John the Baptist in Luke chapter 3, and we find out as he's baptizing and saying all this stuff, people start coming up to him like, "What should we do?" Right? So you have these soldiers who come up to him and say, "What should we do?" And he doesn't say, "Quit your job as soldiers," and he's like, "Make sure you don't use your station to abuse people. Right? Don't take more money than you should. Right? Be content with your wages, and do a good job there." So Elijah, the spirit of Elijah here, John the Baptist kind of tells him, "Don't forsake your callings. Do be faithful in there, and recognize, do it with weakness and much fear and trembling." So well, it's a good thing to pause and reflect on. So I always like that story here as well, reminding us of that calling that we have in life too. That you might have to work out there amongst unbelievers, and how do you function out there? Yeah,
it's hard sometimes to do stuff with a good conscience, but we're called into certain positions, and it's hard to balance sometimes, but you have to find a way. Yeah. And that doesn't necessarily mean forsaking the world. Yeah. Or your callings or your job necessarily. Sometimes it does, but sometimes it doesn't.
Right. It depends if you can keep good faith with it. Yeah. So we had here the axe had recovered as well. A similar situation that kind of breaks out again in chapter 6. But then one of a fun story that you just kind of, like to read a little bit more about, the horses and the chariots of fire. So earlier, Elisha had cried out when Elijah was sending the horses and chariots of fire here. Yeah. And we get to see that again. So the king of Syria is coming down into Israel to go to war. And it's I think it's Elisha knows the battle plan that the king of Syria has, and so he keeps spoiling the plan, and the king can't set an ambush. And then it comes to find out that, Elisha has been saying everything and giving away your plans, like he's almost in the room with us. And so the king gets really upset. And they come after Elisha. And of course, is it Gehazi there again? Or one of his servants? Servant of the man of God, so we're not told his name. Rose early in the morning and went out. Behold, an army with horses and chariots was all around the city. So now this army that was going to go fight Israel is now coming after Elisha. So it's almost like they declared war on Elisha. And so this Elisha's servant goes out one morning, and all on the hills is all this army. He freaks out.
One man.
Yeah, coming after one guy. And he says, "My master, what should we do?" And I love his "Don't be afraid, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them." Which tells you who the prophets are, right? The prophets don't need to have an army behind them. Then Elisha prayed and said, "Oh Lord, please open his eyes that he may see," because his promise that he can't see. I just preached about that a few weeks ago. So the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. And when the Syrians came down against him, Elijah prayed to the Lord and said, "Please strike this people with blindness." And then they're made blind. And then what's great about that, so this army that's coming after Elisha is blinded. That's just kind of like Saul. And they come up and they said, Elisha's like, "Oh, who are you looking for?" And they're like, "Oh, Elisha's like, oh, he's not here. Follow me." So he has like this whole army that he's captured essentially. And like talk about a story that you should be just like laughing at when you're reading this. So then Elisha leads them to the king of Israel with his army, and then all of a sudden their eyes are open. They're like, oh, so Elisha just won this great victory by not even by not raising a finger.
Yeah.
And then it's interesting that they're taken captive, and my father, shall I strike them down? And he's like, you shall not strike them down. Would you strike down those whom have been taken captive with your sword and your bow? Set bread and water before them, that they may eat and drink and go to their master. So they prepared for them a great feast, and when they had eaten and drunk, he sent them away, and they went to their master, and the Syrians did not come again on raids into the land of Israel.
They're probably a little embarrassed.
Just a little bit. But here there's this almost kind of like a reconciliation a little bit. And here are these Gentiles that are now brought in and given this feast from the God of Israel, the people of Israel.
Right.
And so literally here, this God turns them from people coming to attack into people, oh, you're here for now a feast and to enjoy a banquet with us. And what a great image of the
table fellowship
of the Gentiles coming in. And you get this image of the prophets, right? They shall beat their swords into plowshares, into farming tools. And here we get this image here, these warriors coming out to battle to come fight against the people of God, but they end up joining them on a great meal and feast. So a nice prefigurement of, the kingdom of God that we now live in as we're Gentiles being brought into God's kingdom. So yeah, even if it's maybe kicking and screaming and unknowingly, at time or blindness. Being brought in.
He opened their eyes.
And he did. I love it. It's one of those stories just kind of chuckling at when you read. So good. So anything else that you can read about with the prophets that you can kind of think about? Because Elisha keeps doing stuff.
Yeah. There's the thing with the famine next.
Yep. And what do you see about that? What kind of sticks out to you about that account?
Well, there's always the disturbing they were eating their children during the siege of where in Samaria was it? But anyway, what was the capital city of Samaria? Samaria was the capital city of Samaria. Yeah,
it's named after its capital.
Oh.
I feel like we were named Washington, D.C.
Okay. Anyway, the siege of Samaria, and, that's where, the king freaks out when he realizes that the people are eating their children.
Right.
And he goes to Elisha. He wants to kill Elisha, doesn't he?
Yeah.
That's how this one goes. There are all these different stories.
I should be like them if I don't do this to Elijah by this time tomorrow.
Yeah, because he blames Elisha because I'm assuming Elisha somehow. Well, he predicted
right.
He predicted.
So he wants the messenger dead.
Don't kill the messenger.
Right.
And Elisha's basically like, by this time tomorrow, there's going to be plenty of food and plenty of money and everything, and it'll be fine. Basically the people are then again saved by lepers, actually, because. God scared off the Syrians, and the lepers go find out because they were going to go turn themselves in and hope for
better days.
Yeah, because they figure if they stayed where they were going to die in the famine. If they went into the town, they were going to die. But if they went to the king of Syria, they might get
rewarded.
Yeah. And then they find the camp empty.
Yeah.
And what Elisha said comes true.
I love that, which, of course, the captain had said, even if God could open up windows in heaven, could these things be? And Elisha, you're going to see about it, but you're not going to partake in it.
Because the king gets trampled, doesn't he?
Yep. So he gets killed there. And this kind of concludes the story of Elisha. We're going to hear a little bit more from Elisha, because Elisha will die. But here we have kind of the break in the action of the story of the prophets, which they kind of set up how we should be reading the rest of the story here. We've already had little prefigurements of exile, of the Gentiles, of what the people of God should be doing, but they're not. And so this kind of sets up the rest of the book of 2 Kings as we kind of see these themes kind of get brought out and fleshed out.
Elijah and Elisha, if you think of Kings as one book, which it really is, it was just split sort of arbitrarily. Right. You get Solomon, the kingdom splits, and then you get the prophets, Elijah and Elisha, and then you get the rest of the kings.
Yeah. Yeah. So after that we get the one of the last things we read about here from the story of the prophets was, Elijah was told to go anoint a few people and to go anoint Elisha and things like that. And we kind of see the result of that anointing here with Hazael murders Ben-Hadad here. Just kind of the stuff that happens, some tragic things there too. and I think this is the part where he cries. Go say to him,
Man
you
of
shall...
God wept.
Yeah,
Verse 11.
dies. Yeah, and he fixed his gaze, stared at him until he was embarrassed. And the man of God wept, and Hazael said, "Why does my Lord weep?" And he answers, "Because I know the evil that you will do to the people of Israel." So even though Elisha, he anoints him as king and whatnot, and he looks at him and just kind of also he sees kind of the future. He's like, "Oh, you're going to murder my people. You're going to put the whole kingdom in jeopardy." And even I think he affects the southern kingdom too. I think he kills the king of Judah as well.
I lose track.
There's a lot of names to keep track of here. And so here Elisha kind of sees the tragic fall of the kingdoms here a little bit. And so he kind of mourns that. And then it does, the rest of the format for the Book of Kings kind of picks up from here. At the end of chapter 8 and the beginning of chapter 9, we have the back and forth again. Oh, he was king here and he ruled for here. And
this is what he did, and he did evil or he did good, or he followed the way of whichever father.
Right.
And everything else you can read about him in the annals of the kings of Judah or the kings of Israel.
Yeah. Now those are other records that this is being written from. You wish you just had, right?
Yeah, that would be one of those. It'd be like finding when they found the Dead Sea Scrolls. If they could find, which maybe some of the Dead Sea Scrolls are these. Who knows? Because some of them they haven't been read translated yet. Yeah. So that would be interesting if they found those other annals. It'd be like the court records of each of the kings. Kind of thing. It'd be really interesting history. Most likely it was probably lost probably not during the exile since this was written during the exile, but maybe when Jerusalem was sacked in 70 AD, it's possible they were lost. Yeah. Who knows? That's
another one of those records that you wish you had. For example, Pilate, Pontius Pilate, the New Testament, who put Jesus on trial. He would have had an acta. He would have written an account to put into the annals of the kings of Rome, the emperors of Rome. He would have had something like that he would have had to submit every year. And so that would have been somewhere probably burned in Rome somewhere. At some point. And so, it's one of those things
there's
that is
a lot
lost.
of things lost to history.
Yep. There's a couple of good, that one Pontius Pilate, Flames of Rome book by Paul Meyer, he actually has that where they bring out Pontius Pilate's record to look up what these Christians were and who Jesus is. So it's just kind of good stuff. They probably would have done something like that to reference
there were
things.
A lot of written records, more than we maybe think. We think there aren't any written records because we don't have the written records because there was wars, there was burnings. Yeah. A lot of times when a new regime took over, they would
burn all the old records.
Yeah, get rid of all the old statues. I mean, that's just you still see that happen. Nowadays. I mean, there's when a new regime takes over, the old stuff disappears and the history gets rewritten.
And then there's stuff that we just don't have access to. You think some of this too. I was watching a video. We were at Pastor's Winkle a few weeks ago. And when the video was talking about how, places like in Turkey and whatnot, where they live in ancient places, like they had no idea what they're sitting on in terms of like archaeological and historical digs. And that a lot of people will take old ruins and things and they'll just build their houses out of it. So like, go grab a few of those stones from that over there and go take it and we'll build our house out of it. And not knowing that that's probably like some famous building or, they just have no idea what they're sitting on.
You'll hear that randomly, even around here, where someone will buy like an old painting at a garage sale and discover later that it's worth $1 million because it's a Picasso or something.
Right.
So there's a lot that just
look gone. You just can't keep track of it all. Yeah. Yeah. And here, same too, when you get to the biblical records, when you get to some of these, we just don't have it, and what I heard, 99% of stuff we have never been able to find. And
isn't it 99% of the stuff we have found
we can't interpret,
we don't understand, or
we just don't know what to make out of it.
So
it's kind of like the Little Mermaid, Ariel, when she gets a spoon or a fork from the world above, and she's just like, "What is this?" Well, I don't know. And they'll see, it's a hail turner. And you're like, I don't know, maybe it is. And how could we never know? Yeah. Sometimes what helps us with that is actually art. So we'll see they'll use some of those artifacts in art, like, that's what that is. And so we can kind of connect what we see if we have surviving art from the time. It's just, it's an art to be able to figure out all these things as well. So back in Kings, what do you see? Maybe what are some of the main stories and plot lines about these kings of Israel and kings of Judah? We have Jehu, who's kind of an important king. He kind of comes down and
he's the one who executes Jezebel, who was
finally,
Ahab. Yeah, Jehu, Ahab. She finally gets killed. She was the one who was an interesting character in First Kings. Killed the prophets.
And Jehu also assassinated both the king of Israel and the king of Judah. So talk about the turmoil that this guy causes. He kills all these kings.
Descendants.
Yeah. So it's just in fulfillment of the the threat made against Ahab, that his descendants would be put away.
He fulfilled a lot, but his reign was bloody.
Yeah.
That's what when I'm reading that, it's like, okay, he's fulfilling a lot of stuff that was said that was going to happen, but it's not good anyway. It's like when God uses the Babylonians to exile the Israelites, but the Babylonians aren't all that great. They're just being used. Anyway.
Yeah. Jehu is kind of the opposite of Josiah here. Jehu is very violent and bloody and, kills anyone who kind of steps out of line. Where Josiah, he'll have some situations too he has to deal with. But Josiah is very much a reformer in the terms of, all right, knock down these idols and, clean the way here.
Or like Jehu kills the prophets of Baal too.
Yep.
And there's just a lot of really bloody stuff in his reign.
Yeah. Now the acts of Jehu, all of his might, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of Kings of Israel? So Jehu slept with his fathers. This is, chapter 10 here. And they buried him in Samaria, and his son reigned in his place. And he reigned in Samaria 28 years. So this is 28 years of...
Probably the longest reign of a king of Israel.
Jeroboam the second's the longest.
Jeroboam's the second.
42 years or something like that.
His is one of the longer ones.
Yeah, his is one of the longer ones. But probably a very bloody one, too.
Yeah.
And it's probably why he reigned kind of longer, because he just kind of killed anyone who kind of, mildly suspicious of.
And he didn't get rid of the golden calves that were at Bethel and Dan.
Nope, so those are always the sin of Jeroboam that just kind of sticks to Israel forever. And you go on here. Now, this is kind of interesting. I think it's at chapter 11. Attaliah, the mother of Hezekiah, saw that her son was dead. She arose and destroyed all the royal family. So chapter 11 begins with like an oh no moment. This is a threat to the line of David. We've been told that a son shall always reign on the throne of his father David. Yeah. And here we see the king's mother here. So the queen, the king's mom, sees, okay, the king's dead, it's now my turn, and she kills the entire royal household here, except for one. Is it Joash? Yep. And we're told, this kind of reminds us of Moses here a little bit, that the boy is kept safe, and of course, where do they put him? Did you catch that?
Put him and his nurse in a bedroom.
I see chapter 11, verse 3 there.
They hid him in the house of the Lord.
So he's hidden in the temple, which tells you a little bit about Attaliah here, is that she never goes to the house of the Lord.
True.
So he's hidden in the temple there, which is a great, talk about the Psalms that talk about hiding in the shelter of God's presence in here. So Joash is literally being sheltered by God and kept safe and hidden.
It's like we call where we worship the sanctuary.
Right.
It's a sanctuary.
So here he finds sanctuary in the house of the Lord. So the 7th year, so this would be, the queen here is reigning for 6 years. And the 7th year, right, the high priest, Jehoiada, he sends the captains and brings them all, and he makes a covenant with them saying, okay, I'm about to show you and tell you something, and you can't tell anyone, because if you do, you're as good as dead. And then, and he shows them the king's son. So imagine that if you're kind of this crisis moment in Israel, and you're thinking, oh, great. We're having these promises that David has been given to David, that his son will reign forever. And all of a sudden they're shown, here's the king, he's still alive, right? It's kind of, whoa. So there's this kind of a conspiracy here by the priests and the military commanders. We got to, overthrow Attaliah here. And she does. We're told that she cries out treason, but she's put to death for kind of her mutiny here of the kingdom. And the priests restore Joash to the throne, which he's only really young. He's 7 years old when he began to reign there. So we find out there at the end of chapter 11. A 7-year-old, that's the age of imagine my son's Gabriel sitting on the throne, right? Isn't that a picture to behold? little Josiah is going to be 8 years old when he starts ruling.
Yeah.
And they actually turned out to be good. Both Josiah and Joash here. Joash is not as good, but he's still a very good, faithful king.
You imagine they probably at that age still have advisors and stuff doing the actual...
Yeah, they have regents and things like that who are actually coming in and saying, all right, here's the decision. I think you should choose this because here's why. And the king will be like, all right, let's do that. So really it's the regents who are kind of helping, but they're trying to make him make good decisions.
If he has good regents, then he would turn out okay.
Right. And I do believe we are told that as long as Jehoiada the priest is around and alive, that he has a good reign. Let's see. I don't know if it says in here or if it's in Chronicles, because I think Chronicles picks up on that.
I did remember reading it in here. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm looking... Okay, since some of these stories are semi-repetitive, too.
Right.
So it gets... This is what they repaired. Didn't they repair the temple here, too, in his reign?
The Jehoiada box there.
Yeah.
Because the temple's been around now for about 200 years.
Yeah.
So it's time to repair it. Imagine our building. We think of our building here needs to be repaired after just 50 years of things.
Yeah.
That here they need to repair the temple after a couple hundred years.
Maybe it doesn't say that in this one. Yeah. Anyway.
I'll just think maybe that's said in the book of Chronicles, because that's a big sticking point in that one too. So as you kind of push forward, we have the kings going back and forth again. We have in chapter 13 the death of Elisha. So we get one last kind of miracle story here. You have the take the arrows and shoot, and then plunge them into the ground kind of thing. Does it 3 times, and so shall they beat them 3 times. And in chapter 13, verse 20, we get an interesting story here. So Elisha died, and they buried him. Now bands of Moabites used to invade the land in the spring of the year. And as a man was being buried, so another guy's getting buried here, behold, the marauding band was seen, and the man was thrown into the grave of Elisha. So really quickly, they're like, toss him there. And we're told that he hits the bones of Elisha, and he's resurrected. It's kind of, whoa, this is kind of weird. We're not told anything more about this. No more details, except that here, the dead prophet here brings life here. Prefigurement of Jesus here, the one whose death brings us life. And also you can see some of the reasons why you would kind of look towards even like you'd revere or respect the graves of the saints and things like that. Because God's presence is still with Elisha even after death. So it's kind of an interesting thought. As to the identity of the man who was resurrected, some Jewish commentators think this is Jonah, because he's mentioned a chapter later. We don't know. We're not told that that's him or not.
He's mentioned a chapter later?
He's actually mentioned here.
How did I miss that?
It's during the chapter 14, verse 25. He restored the border of Israel to Lebo Hamath as far as the sea of the Arabah, according to the word of the Lord, the God of Israel, which was spoke by his servant Jonah, the son of Amittai. So another instance where we know that Jonah was a real human being. For those who kind of debate that the story of Jonah was fictional or not, that the man Jonah is real. And here we have this account that he was around.
The whole that could be him being, so that's kind of like in Mark where we get the random story of a man who ran away when Jesus was getting arrested.
Yeah.
Where people think that's Mark. This could be
Jonah.
That's interesting. Do you think that would have happened before or after the story?
Good question.
The fish.
It would work well with the idea of him being resurrected from the fish though too. So Jonah keeps getting resurrected. As much as he tries to stop and wants to run away, he just can't get away from God. Yeah. Like I said, we're not told that that's Jonah or not, but there are some Jewish traditions that this is Jonah.
That would be interesting.
Yeah, especially because he is mentioned a chapter later by name. So you get some of this. Amaziah reigns in Judah. We get a little story about him here, but we got to push forward here, so we still got 10 chapters.
Thanks.
Jeroboam II reigns in Israel. He reigns for a really long time. It's a restoration of an old kingdom. He's really prosperous, even though he's very unfaithful though too. We keep going back and forth between these kings. You see the patterns, right? These kings reign. They've either done good or evil based upon how faithful they've been. And then they die, and the next king takes over. So you get a few chapters of that. But for the northern kingdom of Israel, as you start getting to chapters 14 and 15 and 16, you start seeing more of a decline. In fact, we're told that God starts taking away some of their land, just as he promised he would do in his curses. So we start seeing these covenant curses becoming more prevalent. And, these kings don't turn away, they don't listen. And then finally, in chapter 17, we get kind of a collapse, a fall here. So chapter 17 picks up with, in the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom. And he carried the Israelites away to Assyria and placed them in Halah on the Habor, the river of the Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes. So we get here finally in 722 BC that the northern kingdom of Israel falls. And it doesn't just get attacked and then they leave. It is destroyed, wiped out. The golden calves are destroyed.
People are taken away.
And the people are taken away. So the 10 northern tribes become lost.
The 10 lost tribes, because they never come back.
They never come back. A couple of survivors and remnants escape down south, especially we find that out in Chronicles. But for the most part, the 10 northern tribes just vanish from history. They don't really keep track of them anymore. Most likely what they did is they went to the lands that they went to, and already they had no idea who the Lord their God was at this point, and so they just adopted the custom of wherever people they went to and just faded away from history.
So it's possible some of us are actually descendant of some of the Israelites and don't know it because
right,
they would have gotten mixed in with other
tribes. So there might be Israelite in pieces of parts of us here. Because the Assyrians would scatter, and this is kind of the ancient practice back in the day. So the Assyrians they're the kind of empire, and they are, in terms of really nasty, horrible people, the Assyrians are probably even more so than the Babylonians. The Assyrians are the one who invented crucifixion, which back then it was just a giant pole, a sharp pole they just shoved someone on until they died, and they invented that. The capital city is Nineveh, which we hear about in Jonah and things like that, and Prophet Nahum. And it's just a really bad, violent people. And part of their tactic was when you came and conquered a people, you don't want them rising up again. So what you do is you just take the survivors and you send some over here and you send some over there. You spread them all over.
And you resettle the land.
So that way it's no longer a threat. The people don't know anybody, right? They're confused because they're hearing different languages, and we can't unify ourselves and resist and rise up. And so it's kind of their way of putting down any potential rebellions that could ever happen.
Which apparently worked.
Which worked. The Babylonians get a little bit smarter than that. And they say, we'll take your smartest people and we'll use them, which we'll see with Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and people like that. Esther. So the Babylonians kind of learn from that. They still practice that, but they'll say, we'll take the cream of the crop and we'll use them to make us better. And then there's also the Persians kind of get rid of the practice, which we'll see when we get to the return from exile, because they don't want to upset the gods. Because Cyrus is very superstitious, and so he's like, you guys go home and rebuild your temple. You guys go home and rebuild your temples, worship your gods, and pray for me, because I need it. So Cyrus is a little bit more on the wise side, because he recognizes that I'm making all of your gods mad by taking you away and not giving them proper worship, so you should probably go home and do that. Otherwise, they're going to get mad at me. So Cyrus is a little bit on that superstitious side of things, but also faithful. And then chapter 17 gives us a good snapshot picture when we read this of how to read the story so far. So the story pauses in chapter 17. It says, here's why this exile has happened. And it goes through why. And as you read that, what do you notice about why the exile happened?
Well, and the people of Israel did secretly against the Lord their God things that were not right. They built the high places. They had with Asherah poles, and they served idols, even though the Lord said, you shall not do this. And the Lord warned them by every prophet and every seer, saying, turn from your evil ways. But they would not listen. It's basically the gist of it. They despised his statutes and his covenants. They worshipped idols. They forsook the covenant, and God did to them what he said he was going to do if they did that. So
we're going right back to Deuteronomy and Joshua, the last words of Moses when he said, what you guys are going to do is you're going to forsake the Lord and he's going to kick you out of the land. Well, Here we are. All this occurred, right, because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. So we're back in the book of Exodus. Here's what God had done, and his people decided, thanks, we'll do our own thing now. And therefore, he kicks them out. We're told here, therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel because they didn't listen to his prophets. They did not come back. So finally, the only thing he could do was kick them out.
I'm going to say they had plenty of warning.
Hundreds
Which we'll get to more when we get to more of the prophets.
If you want, they lived in the land for over 700 years.
Yeah.
So this is 700 years of God calling them back and being patient. Talk about a long time. Our country's not even a third of that age yet. Yeah. And here God was patient with them for all these years. We're told that Judah is the only tribe left, but unfortunately, Judah does also not keep the commandments and keep the covenant of the Lord. So the Lord rejects all of them, we're told, and we're kind of like, okay, well, he hasn't kicked Judah out yet, so what is this going to look like?
We got to get to that yet.
And here we'll get to that.
Which we should probably, since, the next part here, Assyria resettles Samaria, this is where we get the idea of the Samaritans in Jesus' day, too.
Yep.
So a lot of people, I think, get to the Gospels and are like, they're talking about the Samaritans. Who are the Samaritans?
Yeah.
They apparently worship God, but they're like, what was the half-breeds, the half-Jews, they're the ones who... The people got resettled in this area, and we get here, that God sends lions amongst them, and they're like, get some prophets in here and let's figure out how to worship this God, because that's here, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so they sort of worship God, but they also don't.
They don't. Syncretism.
And so that's where we get the whole Jewish-Samaritan rivalry in the Gospels.
Yeah, so here's where the Samaritans come from, and that's why they're, the capital of Samaria. This is why they're also called that. So it's the leftover children of Israel. And what's interesting is that they actually come into play, I think it's in Nehemiah, when they're trying to rebuild the temple, and the Samaritans want to come in and build too, and they're like, you guys aren't Israelites, you're half-breeds. And that gets the Samaritans mad, and they start blood feuds and almost Hatfield and McCoy kind of killing each other kind of thing. And so this rivalry will continue into the future here, which builds into the New Testament.
Yeah.
So finally, we push forward here. We got to find out what happens to the kingdom of Judah. And we pick up in chapter 18 with them actually having a really good king. The king Hezekiah, he's a righteous king, a good guy. We find out some really interesting, which we'll actually read about in the book of Isaiah, so maybe we'll take more time then to look at this there, because this story in chapter 18 and 19 actually comes to play in the book of Isaiah. Again, it's all fleshed out, and in fact, in a little bit more detail too. But essentially, Isaiah, the king of Samaria, the king of Assyria, once he's destroyed Israel, he's like, well, why not just continue on through to Judah and conquer them too? Well, Hezekiah, when they come to the gates of the city of Jerusalem and try to destroy it and everything, Hezekiah keeps faith, and he trusts in the Lord of God. He humbles himself, and he does what's good in the eyes of God, and so God spares Judah, and the army of Assyria is sent home packing. They get confused, they hear a bad report, and they go back, and then the leader's assassinated and whatnot, so it throws everything into confusion, so God protects his people Judah, at least for now. So Hezekiah does what's right in the eyes of the Lord. We get the prophet Isaiah comes into the picture here too, so we see how he's in here. Some people think Isaiah wrote parts of Kings as well. You can maybe see that.
Yeah.
He was around for a while to write some of it. We do get also Hezekiah's prayer that he prays here about this, Isaiah's promise to him. So we see when Hezekiah relies on the prophets of the Lord and the priests and the Lord and everything like that, things go well for his kingdom. Hezekiah gets sick in chapter 20, and he's weeping. Isaiah comes and tells him to put his house in order. Hezekiah prays and says, Lord, I've been faithful my whole life, look on me with good, and God actually grants the prayer and says, I'll give you 15 more years of life. So we see about how God, has all of our days numbered in his hand. Well, he actually adds on days to Hezekiah's life. And which actually turns out maybe it wasn't for the best, because at that time, after he recovers, we're told that there are some Babylonian envoys, so some people from Babylon who come and visit King Hezekiah, and Hezekiah is like, come on in and look
rolls
around.
Rolls out the welcome mat.
Yep, come look at this, look at that. Isn't this great? And Isaiah gets wind of this and says, so, what did you show them? And
everything.
Isn't this fantastic? And you got to remember who the Babylonians are, right? They're not maybe big in our biblical story yet, but they're kind of the preeminent enemies of God. We can remember Babel back in Genesis. They're always kind of these people who were rebelling against God.
They used a lot. The name's used a lot in the prophets.
It is. And even Peter will pick up on this, that the people who live in Rome are living in Babylon. The people who are against God. So here, Isaiah says, well, okay, well, just know because you showed them everything, know that one day they will come in and not just going to look at everything, they're going to take everything. That's everything, even if it's nailed down, they're going to walk off with. And Hezekiah's like, well, at least it won't happen in my day.
Yeah.
Okay. It reminds me of Neville Chamberlain and World War II when he says, we've secured peace for our time. And, they're happy with, we've just sold these people, but it's okay because we have peace now for the moment. And we kind of see it here with Hezekiah with, hey, at least we're good for now.
It's not going to happen here.
Yep. And then we get and you mentioned this too, right? After righteous King Hezekiah.
His son
Manasseh, who probably killed Isaiah. Yeah, we're told that Manasseh sawed Isaiah in half in a log, tradition says. So.
Yeah, it happens a lot in here where you have this really good king and then the son is terrible. And you always wonder, was the guy just not a good father? Or was in this case, Manasseh started reigning when he was 12, so, maybe, he's only 12. His father's probably died if he's taking over. You just kind of wonder how you end up with rebellious sons, basically. Anyway, because Manasseh whereas Hezekiah tore down all the altars and stuff to Baal and all the high places, Manasseh basically reinstates all of them and does everything the exact opposite of what he's supposed to do.
Yep. So we get, a tragic situation here. Manasseh reinstates the pagan worship practices. Yeah. We're told he fills the city of Jerusalem with so much innocent blood that from one end of the city to another is filled with Manasseh's sin.
Verse 9 here in chapter 21, Manasseh led them astray to do more evil than the nations had done, whom the Lord destroyed before the people of Israel. So if the Lord, you got to the point where if the Lord pushed those people out of the land using the Israelites, the Israelites are probably going to get pushed out.
Yep. And eventually, we're told he does reign for a while. He reigns 55 years. So talk about a wicked king. So just because he reigns for a long time doesn't mean he's a good guy. So here, 55 years he reigns, and he does finally die, mercifully. But he's the reason why God eventually says, all right, my people Judah are going into exile too.
Yep.
It was kind of the final straw. Amon, his son, he only reigns for 2 years. So we talk about, very upsetting reign. There's a conspiracy, and they made Josiah the king in his place, and he's 8 years old. So once again, we've had Joash, who was 7 years old, and now Josiah, who's 8 years old.
And Josiah does good.
Yeah, he reigns 31 years, and this is kind of Josiah's the last gasp of the kingdom of the south. He's the last righteous king, and he's also the one after him. Everyone reigns for max 10 years. The last 3 or 4 kings after him are either 6 months or a couple of years, or Zedekiah is 10 years, but Josiah really is the last gasp, and it's actually all of his children because there's no descendants after Josiah's kids that take over. It's all the nephews and the uncles and things like that reign. So Josiah has, he totally finds the book of the law.
Yes. They're repairing the temple.
Yep.
And
fine again.
The guy comes and is like, "Hey, we found this book.
What is this?"
And which, as we've already, I think we talked about this before. Back, it says the king way back. What the king is supposed to do. Each king is supposed to sit down with Book of the Law and write it out. So this has not been happening. They do not have the Bible, basically. Yeah. And so when the what's his name, the king's Hezekiah, the secretary and the priest and stuff read the Book of the Law, which would be like the Torah.
Yep.
The King. Josiah is, he tears his robes. Is like,
what have we done?
What? We're not doing what we're supposed to be doing, which is interesting because actually, the people were still offering sacrifices. They were still worshiping God, but they were also worshiping the Baals and the Asherahs, and
which tells you what's going on in the temple.
They have the male cult prostitutes in the temple. They have altars to Baal in the temple.
Yeah.
And so they freak out because they find the Book of the Law.
Yeah. So Josiah, he's a man on a mission from that point on, and he starts reforming. He's like, all right, all these Asherah poles, those are gone. All the stuff that's happening in the temple, that's done. All these pagan practices. He goes around, he's putting the prophets of Baal to death and things like that. He's trying to cleanse Israel because he recognizes we have done so much great sin that we're going to be kicked out. Yeah. And he's right?
And they're already going to be kicked out, but...
It's too late.
Well, because as we've already seen, you get one good king, but the next one isn't...
Miserable, yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't last ever.
And Josiah, he has what we know from Jeremiah the prophet in his book that actually Josiah and Jeremiah were actually good friends, that they're really close. And it sounds, and we do find out, I forget where it's written, but when Josiah dies, Jeremiah actually writes a lament for him. That's just how close they were, because Jeremiah recognized, oh, great, now that Josiah's gone, this is going down. We're told here that Josiah actually fulfills a couple of the promises that had been made, the prophets had said. And we're told that he breaks down the gate of the high places that were in the entrance to the gate of Joshua, the governor of the city, which were left there. And I do believe, I don't think this is Josiah, but Hezekiah is the one that tears down the bronze statue, the bronze serpent.
Oh, yeah.
I think we forgot to mention that here.
Yeah, I forgot. Because I read that. I was like, oh, yeah, we need to mention that because wherever that is. I think I can find it. Basically, the people were starting to worship the serpent on the bronze pole from that Moses had made. Where the people looked at it, they were... but people were treating it as an idol, and so he got rid of it.
Right. Yeah, see if I can find it real quick, because it is a really good...
I feel like it
should be right.
Should know where. I thought it was right around 18 or 19.
Yeah. It's one of those things we'll have to look up again at some point. But yeah, so the bronze serpent that Moses had lifted up in the wilderness had become an idol. Yeah. I think they called it Hanakash or something like that, which means the serpent, which is kind of interesting. It goes
to show a good thing that God created can be turned into an idol, and then it should probably go.
Right. So Josiah is reforming. He back in 1 Kings chapter 13, we had heard the high places there at Bethel.
Oh, I found it.
Where's it at?
Chapter 18.
Chapter 18.
Verse 2. He removed the high places and broke the pillars and cut down the Asherah, and he broke in pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made, for until those days the people of Israel had made offerings to it. It was called Nehushtan.
Yeah, which means the serpent. Yeah.
Oh. So, yeah.
Yeah, so interesting kind of tidbit there that you can gloss over and forget about.
Yeah, it's just one of those, again, something that was good got turned into an idol, and...
Yeah. So Israel's turning everything that was good into bad.
Yeah. Because, again,
corrupting.
They were worshiping God, but they weren't only worshiping God. So, there's the lesson there, too, that, you should only worship God the way He wants to be worshipped. If you're going to start, you can't serve both God and money kind of idea. You can't serve two gods.
It's kind of like when you get that concept of people saying, oh, I guess it can't hurt if I believe that, too, right? So all of a sudden it can't hurt.
You get that in... where you start thinking all roads lead to God, that the ELCA did this at their last convention or the convention before that, where they had a representative of the Muslims and the Hindus and all that, and they're like, oh yeah,
there's other acceptable ways
they're
to
all
God.
just totally acceptable, and it's like, no.
Right. And
it's not.
Denies Jesus the glory of being Savior and Lord. Yeah. Now are letting other lords be Lord too.
Yeah, and so there is it can seem like you're worshiping the right way, but if you're also doing this other stuff, you're not worshiping rightly.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Anyway.
We can look right in practice, but our hearts are far. Right.
Also, the written word is important. The Bible, because like I said, Jeremiah and Josiah were friends. I mean, Jeremiah was speaking to Josiah for a few years before they found the book of the law, and now all of a sudden it's like the book, the actual words. It's like, oh,
surprise.
That's what led into the actual reform. It's not like Jeremiah wasn't saying stuff before this, but it's like, I don't know,
there's a written confirmation of what Josiah is hearing, going, dawns on him. So Josiah, even we're told he restores the Passover. And it says it hasn't been a day like this since the days of Solomon, if it's written in here. For verse 22 here in chapter 23, for no such Passover had been kept since the days of the judges who judged Israel. So it's a time period that was really bad. The judges is a really bad time frame, but a Passover hasn't been celebrated like that since their days. For since the days of the judges who judged Israel, all the days of the kings of Israel or the kings of Judah, but in the 18th year of King Josiah, this Passover was kept to the Lord in Jerusalem. Wow, so talk about a momentous moment here. But at the end of it, we're told, at the end of chapter 23, before him there was no king like him, who turned to the Lord with all his heart and with all his soul and with all his might, according to all the law of Moses, nor did any like him arise after him. Still, the Lord did not turn from his burning of his great wrath, by which his anger was kindled against Judah, because of the provocations with which Manasseh had provoked him. And the Lord said, I will remove Judah also out of my sight, as I have removed Israel, and I will cast off the city that I have chosen, Jerusalem, and the house of which I said my name shall be there. Which is tragic, right? So despite all of Josiah's reforms and his changes, it's too late. It's day late and a dollar short, as we would say. Josiah, sadly, we find out, dies in battle, which we find out more detail in Chronicles, I do believe, about the battle. Josiah dies there. It's tragic. He's buried in the tomb of his fathers. His son reigns. We're told how long? 3 months. So
yeah, I think that's the shortest
not good.
reign.
Yeah, so 3 months he reigns. Jehoiakim, he reigns 11 years. We'll hear a little bit more about Jehoiachin after him. Chapter 24, we hear about King Nebuchadnezzar. Everyone knows about King Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king of Babylon. This is the first deportation. So at 605 BC is the very first time that Nebuchadnezzar kind of comes and says, I'm taking away some of you, which Daniel is there. Ezekiel is a part of that too. 597, he comes again a second time and takes more of them. And so there's only like a few of them left at that point. And then finally in 587, 587, he comes back down and wipes the rest of them off the map. So it's kind of like God does three kind of, all right, guys, strike one, strike two, and okay, that's it.
Yeah.
So we get that finally. End of chapter 24, Jehoiakim sleeps with his fathers. Jehoiachin raises in his place, but we find out that Jehoiachin, he reigns for 3 months in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Neshushta, which is kind of an interesting name. And he did what was evil, and then King Nebuchadnezzar comes and takes him away into Babylon, which he's freed later on. And then he puts up his puppet, Nebuchadnezzar does, of Zedekiah. And Zedekiah is 21 years old, and he reigns 11 years, so he's 32. And he does evil in the eyes of the Lord. And because of the anger of the Lord, it came to the point in Jerusalem and Judah that he cast them out from his presence. And then finally we hear, and Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. So finally, the last chapter, in chapter 25, we get the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, and it goes in detail, right? Yeah, everything that Solomon had made is destroyed and taken down, melted down, carried off to Babylon. Everything. It's just laid waste, and the rest of the people are taken away from their home. We get Gedaliah, who's made the governor, so there's no more kings. Gedaliah, but he's also murdered. And that's more in the book of Jeremiah that we hear about that. And the rest of the people then flee to Egypt. So the end of the book of Kings has, all right, some are going over here to Babylon, others have returned to Egypt, where they were told not to ever go again. And now they're all scattered. The kingdom is destroyed. David's son, his reign is over because Zedekiah's sons are dead. Zedekiah's eyes put out. And it just looks like it's over, right? And you're kind of left with a crisis mode. How are we going to offer sacrifices? How can we worship God? What about the promises that God made to David, right? It's all up in the air. But then we get a flash forward here to 561 BC. So the people were taken away. This is about 25 years later. And so in the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiachin, which he was exiled before the destruction of Jerusalem, in the 12th month, on the 27th day of the month, Evil Merodach, king of Babylon, in the year that he began to reign, freed Jehoiachin, king of Judah, from prison, and he spoke kindly to him and gave him a seat above all the seats of the kings who were with him in Babylon. So Jehoiachin put off his prison garments, and every day of his life he dined regularly at the king's table, and for his allowance a regular allowance was given to him by the king according to his daily needs as long as he lived.
So David's line
continues on. Yeah. So it's kind of like this is the book's way of saying, yep, all this has happened, it's a terrible travesty, but the promise is still on. God is going to keep his word. So we get that little silver lining, that little glimmer of hope that pushes us into the future. And we're going to see that a little bit with the return from exile in Zerubbabel, because Zerubbabel is the grandson of Jehoiachin, which will then carry on David's line.
Which we will get into in a couple months now.
Yeah.
When we get into Ezra and Nehemiah.
Yeah, so we'll have fun with that. So all in good time. Looks about a month from now we'll be digging into that. So in the new year we'll be there.
Yeah, because now we got a couple of the epistles and the Chronicles, which will take a while too.
Yeah, it'll be fun. So we'll get there. But anything else you can think of in the books of 1st or 2nd Kings, or anything that you kind of catch?
Good.
It's a lot.
I get the names all screwed up, and so that's why I can never keep any of it straight. But I'm not very good with names, especially when I can't pronounce them. But
especially some of those names.
Yeah, they're all the same: Josiah and Jehoiakim and Jehu, and they all start with J.
Oh, lots of J's, yeah. Which is probably that they have a lot of the root names for Yahweh in it, so you kind of have that kind of thought in there. Because it is a king's son, and so the son of David was always seen as God's son. You get that in Psalm 2. So you kind of have a little bit of that name in there, which of course works well for Jesus, who is the Son of God. Good. Well, then that's what we'll end for today. We'll pick up with this next week as we jump into Philippians.
Yes,
We're going to be back in the New Testament, so you'll have a lot to say about that.
I think Philippians is my favorite of Paul's epistles.
It is good. Good stuff. Well, let's close with prayer then, and then a blessing. Dear God, Heavenly Father, as we read through the books of the kings of Israel and Judah, we see stories of great sin, stories of great faith. Lord, grant us eyes to see and hearts to hear your word, that as it has now come to us, your word has been found by us, help us to do all that has been found there, to believe in him whom you have sent, our Savior, Jesus Christ, our Lord, who is bringing in not just the children of Israel, but of all nations and all people. Lord, grant that to us for the sake of him who died and rose for us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord look upon you with favor and give you peace. Amen.